Whoa, whoa, whoa. Before we get to the video, it's probably something you should know. This is part 2 of a 2-part video. So if you haven't seen part 1, I highly recommend you either click the card up above or click the link down below to part 1 of this video. However, if you already have seen part 1, I want to thank you very much for coming back, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. So anyways, that is No Way Street. So the next book that I'm going to be reviewing is going to be Orgy of the Dead by Ed Wood Jr. This is going to be a Centipede Press edition. There are some older paperback editions, but this is the edition that I have. I picked this up from Centipede Press, I think 2 years ago, and it was just after I discovered Ed Wood by watching Plan 9 from Outer Space. And brief caveat, if you haven't seen that movie, absolutely go find it. I believe it's streaming, and I believe you could also buy it on iTunes, so highly recommend checking that out. And this is the book that I was talking about in my book haul video, where I was talking about the next review I was going to give. And while it is a fairly interesting and pretty good book, not going to lie, unfortunately the plot I can sum up in a couple sentences. And it's literally a couple go to the mountains but get trapped in a storm as they're returning on their way home. They crash their car. They wake up after their car accident finding themselves in a cemetery. And this was actually the cemetery that they were looking for earlier in the story. And while in the cemetery, they witness a graveyard ceremony where the recently deceased are judged by the Emperor and Empress of Darkness, which are two vampires. And at the very end, the two protagonists are rushed to the hospital in an ambulance, wondering if what they encountered in the graveyard was real or make-believe. And that's about it. It's a very campy and cheesy book. Obviously, if you know anything about Ed Wood, you can almost imagine the scenes and how it would look based on his other films. So if you're a diehard Ed Wood fan, I do recommend this. But unfortunately, the book is very repetitive. Once you actually get into the graveyard, you have like 6 or 7 chapters where it is almost copy and paste. A monster appears, a monster gives a long monotonous statement on why it is receiving judgment and what happened in its life. It receives judgment from the Emperor and Empress, which is either being allowed to remain among the living dead, for instance, or being forced to spend eternity amongst the shadow creatures that basically consume them, and it's never-ending torment. And that's it. You do have the subplot of Bob and Shirley being captured and being mistaken as ghosts, and they're waiting to receive their judgment. But other than that, there's not a whole lot to the story. However, I will say this. For the most part, a lot of the creatures are fairly stereotypical. You have a mummy, which doesn't make any sense to be in this graveyard, but for whatever reason, it's there. There was one ghost that was receiving judgment that honestly was pretty dark. For all of its campy and lighthearted moments, there was actually one character that had a really dark backstory, and I wasn't even expecting it. The voodoo woman is pretty interesting. I liked hers as well, especially since hers has the irony of learning voodoo from this witch, and she learned this spell. And so she was doing this spell with the voodoo doll, and she was going to turn it back onto the witch that had taught her, and she performs the spell, and she ends up killing herself. I liked the poetic irony in that, but furthermore, there is a character who ran a former mortuary, but he's an absolute con man. He basically explains all the corrupt business practices that he did. And I actually have some notes here, so I do apologize if I'm just reading off of this, but I want you to get the entire picture. This is not directly from the book, but these are the notes that I took from it, and I just want you to hear this. So, a man emerges from a crypt. He is in a full suit and has a top hat and cane. He's a wisecracking former businessman who ran a former mortuary business. He would perform funerals for individuals' loved ones, and then shear their hair for wigs, ground their meat, freeze their blood, clean and whiten their skeletons, and sell all of it. Also, he would make the customers pay for makeup, hair treatments, and outfits that they never received, and just pocket the cash. I thought that backstory that he made for him was very original and quite dark. So that is the backstory that's probably the highlight of this book. When I read it, it almost gave me chills. So that passage I really enjoyed. So for those of you who are actually interested in picking up the Centipede Press version, this is the cover. You have the two protagonists, which is Shirley and Bob. You have a mummy and you have some skeletons there. On the back, you have the prince and princess, or I believe they're actually called the Emperor and Empress of Darkness, and they're two vampire-like creatures. I will show you a little bit inside of here. This is actually the original cover illustration for the original paperback that was published, I think, in the 70s. I can't quite remember. Here's another illustration. So obviously, since it is Centipede Press, there is a limited number of these. In fact, I think, yeah, this is actually a numbered and signed copy. Hopefully you can see that. If you can't find a copy of this, I do recommend it. So yeah, but other than that, there's not a whole lot more I can say about this book. It was very fun and also very festive to be reading during October. You got a good deal of classic monsters and also some 1950s campiness, so that's always a joy. So that's the end of Orgy of the Dead, and now on to the next one. Now it's time to get to the weird. These next couple stories that I'm going to be talking about are stories from H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard. So the first story that I want to talk about is The Color Out of Space. This is an illustrated edition of H.P. Lovecraft's story, The Color Out of Space, and this is actually published by Necronomicon Press that is still doing stuff. So if you enjoy Lovecraft or anybody from the Weird Tales circle, then you should definitely check out Necronomicon Press. I will be sure to put some pictures on the screen. It's heavily illustrated throughout the entire book, and they really add to the story. Actually getting to the story of The Color Out of Space. I believe I started reading this story when I was younger. I think when I first discovered Lovecraft, I was well aware of the reputation that Color Out of Space had. So I wanted to read it. I think I tried, got distracted, and I never finished it. So after all these years, I finally decided to pick it up again and read it, especially because I wanted to read it before watching the movie that came out. So anyways, on the actual story, and I will do my best to not spoil the story in case some of you haven't read it and want to, but all I can say is I cannot recommend this enough. This is probably one of my favorite Lovecraft stories. The Thing on the Doorstep is a close second, and I know a lot of people say that The Thing on the Doorstep isn't even one of his best works, but that's actually the story that got me into Lovecraft. So that's why it's very near and dear to my heart. But this is up there with one of my favorite Lovecraft stories. I loved the atmosphere that he was able to portray, and it was just a genuinely good story. Lovecraft doesn't get in his own way. There are a few repetitive things in here, like the fact that the scientists come down from Arkham twice. You know, honestly, he could have compressed that into one occurrence or whatnot, but nevertheless, it is Lovecraft, so you just kind of have to deal with that. But it's just a genuinely good story, and you really begin to feel for these people. This bizarre and kind of exciting thing happens to this small farming family, and then they begin to realize that it's not exactly a good thing. Misfortune continues to strike the family, and it really makes you feel for this family because they didn't do anything. They did nothing wrong. Something happens to this family, and bad thing after bad thing continues to follow. Literally, all the crops that they have are inedible. All their livestock they have begin to die, and it's not just they keel over and die, it's they begin to decay while alive. That has to be one of the most painful and gruesome ways to die. We always pair decaying with death, with the actual act of being dead, but having the living actually begin the process is very disheartening and quite grotesque. I don't want to spoil the end, so I think I'll probably leave it at that. This is a great Lovecraft story and one of my favorites. I've reread it twice now, and I've watched the new movie, which, small caveat, I highly recommend. I'm thinking about even doing a video on that. So please read this story. Please watch the movie. They are both absolutely amazing. Now, moving on to the next story, which is The Doom That Came to Sarnath. So I wasn't even planning on rereading this because I read this once, but the thing is I didn't remember a lot of it. When I first discovered Lovecraft, in fact, this is the Necronomicon right here, is the first book I ever got of Lovecraft. And I read it in this book. Back in high school, when I read The Doom That Came to Sarnath, it was fine. It was interesting, especially since it was Lovecraft, and I never read anything like it before. So it was interesting enough, but it was not great. And I think I forgot about it. And honestly, it became one of those stories that I knew I had read, but I could not tell you a single thing about it. As I mentioned earlier in this video, I picked up this book, and the story that is in this is The Doom That Came to Sarnath. So I decided to reread it in that, and it's fine. It's a good story, but it's not great. It's interesting enough to somewhat keep your attention, and the world he creates is fairly unique. But at the end of it, you're just kind of wanting, you just want more. And as The Color Out of Space leaves you wanting more, The Doom That Came to Sarnath, like, you want more of a different story, whereas The Color Out of Space, you want more of that story. It's a fine story. It's good for anybody who's wanting to get into Lovecraft and trying to understand the way he writes, but it's not a great Lovecraft story. So I will leave it at that. And finally, The Rats in the Walls. This was another story I think I got like halfway through when I was younger and just never finished. And I will, again, do my best to not spoil anything, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a very well done story. It is just shy of being great, but it is still really, really good. I think what may make it good and not great is due to the fact that this is very much a gothic story written by Lovecraft. And I thought it was interesting that Lovecraft chose to go the route of the gothic opposed to anything cosmic. And Lovecraft has several stories where he writes in the gothic kind of tone. The Statement of Randolph Carter is also fairly gothic. It takes place in this decrepit cemetery. Somebody goes down into the catacombs and whatnot, and something is encountered there. So I would say that is fairly gothic as well. It reminds me of the old Frankenstein movies made by Universal. So he can do gothic really well, and he does. He does it very, very well in this story. But for me, it lacked a certain impactfulness that I mentioned earlier. So it's a very good story, and I will reread it again. But unfortunately, it just isn't quite one of my favorites. It is still a very, very good story, and I highly recommend anybody who's getting into Lovecraft or anybody who just hasn't read it to give it a shot. It's very good. Okay, guys, we're almost done here. The next couple stories I want to talk about are all written by Robert E. Howard. And I think I mentioned in my book haul video that I recently picked up a lot of Robert E. Howard's books. I've absolutely fallen in love with his writing. So the first couple stories that I'm going to talk about both come out of this collection. And this is going to be the Cole Exile of Atlantis collection. And they just so happen to be the first two stories in this book. The first one is going to be Untitled or Exile of Atlantis. It's a very interesting story, especially for Howard if you've read some of his other stuff, because not a lot of action happens. Which, again, this is the guy who created Conan and Solomon Kane. Howard is known for creating action and adventures. And not a lot happens in this story. This story is far more about atmosphere and mood than it is about any action that happens. In fact, the only action that happens is towards the very end of the story, and it's kind of just over like that. It's essentially Cole and two other Atlanteans traveling through the mountains of Atlantis. And again, it is all mood. It's them talking and them just on this journey. And at the very end, something happens. I don't want to spoil it, so I won't. But at the very end, something happens, and Cole decides to take action, even when it's kind of unclear if he should. And even then, the action that he takes, many people would say, isn't the right action. So I suppose it all depends on your view. And for being a story that's only 5 pages, it's able to convey all of this. So I thought that was very interesting. I do apologize for being vague, but I don't want to ruin the story. So the next one is going to be The Shadow Kingdom, which is also in this book. It's a King Cole story, and it was very fun. It is more the traditional sword and sorcery. There's magic, there's fights, there's action, there's mystery. So it has all of those elements and everything that I would probably assume to be the traditional sword and sorcery tale. I don't want to tell too much more, but it was very effective in its action scenes and also the mystery. It had me confused for a little while, but then it explains and it continues to build until the very end, which is very entertaining. King Cole I find to be fairly interesting. I have not read any Conan yet, so I don't know how he compares, but I do understand why Cole has gotten so much praise. Guys, that's it. I do hope you kind of liked this little hybrid. I do realize that it's been a while since I posted. That's why I wanted to make this long video. If there are any of these books that you want a more in-depth review on, again, like some of the ones that I just got from my book haul, please feel free to let me know. Also, if you have any questions for me, please leave a comment down below and I will do my very best to get back to you. So you guys have a great rest of your day and go read something.